Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider being a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate through the link given in the description box. Also consider like, share, and comment. Joining us today from Beirut is the Iranian professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You are in Beirut, and we are hearing about former Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah's massive funeral that has pulled tens of thousands of crowds. The event kicked off with a speech by Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei that was read out to the funeral. Can you talk about the significance of this massive participation in the funeral?
Actually, one estimate was at 1.4 million, a bit over 1.4 million. Another estimate was well over a million. And that shows how enormous the funeral was. The stadium itself was packed, and people were on the field as well. And then outside, the numbers were much 10 times perhaps bigger than whatever we saw inside the stadium or under and around the stadium. So the numbers were huge. And when you take into account the fact that Lebanon is not a big country and it does not have a huge population, you can imagine the significance of the funeral and how many people actually took part. And Hezbollah, of course, has to maintain its forces in the south and in the east now that Syria has been occupied both by the Israeli regime and by Al Qaeda. So it's quite extraordinary, these numbers. And we saw the Israeli regime use fighter jets to fly over the mourners, which was really disgusting. And they did it twice. And it's unbelievable that this can be done in today's world where they threaten, let's say, 1.5 million people and try to cause terror and a stampede in the hope that people would die. But it was what I found even more extraordinary was the response of the population. I was in the stadium, and the response was complete defiance. No one moved an inch, and people started chanting slogans against the Israeli regime. And in the second flyover, they were even ignored more than the first time around. They weren't even taken seriously by the people. I was, you know, I expected this to be very open because I've been to Lebanon many times. I know a lot about the supporters of the resistance, but I think that many of the guests who were there, the international guests, were appalled by the the how openly the regime can do this and how Western media will say nothing about it and there'll be no condemnation. And even the government in Lebanon didn't condemn it. This is just how pathetic it is, the situation, and how the government is basically controlled by the United States and the allies of this apartheid and genocidal regime. But
And
they were appalled.
there were
But they were stunned. These guests by the resilience and the courage of all these people, not thousands of people, not tens of thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands of people, but well over 1 million people. They just stood their ground and started chanting slogans against the Israeli regime, the same regime that carried mass slaughter in this city just 2, 3 months ago. They bombed apartment blocks, slaughtering tens of people in each airstrike. In some airstrikes, slaughtering over 100 people at in one single strike because they didn't care about who was there. They just wanted to get rid of people. Remember, we're all Amalek. We're all subhuman in the eyes of the chosen people. And Western journalists in Beirut at that time when the bombing was taking place, and I was here during the first week of the war when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was was martyred. I was in this building that I'm in right now, and very near the place that where he was, and he was martyred. So at that time, the Western journalists here in Beirut were saying they're bombing strongholds or Hezbollah targets, whereas these journalists live in Beirut. They knew that these were apartment blocks. Their fixers, some of them lived in these neighborhoods. Their producers knew these neighborhoods well. Their cameramen, some of them probably lost their homes, but they would constantly say Hezbollah strongholds because the Western media is basically they are a partner in this genocide, in this strikes, just like what we saw in Gaza. So the people who were chanting and who wouldn't budge were the same people who experienced the genocidal airstrikes of this filthy regime.
You mentioned about the international guests, and I was quite, let me not say surprised, but it struck me that there were more than 65 international guests, perhaps underreported. I don't know. I read in Al Jazeera. It is not something that you can imagine based on what the Western reports are generally. You said you were there. If you could talk a little bit about the mood of the people, you said that about the defiance, but I wanted to ask you about this idea that a lot of people there were saying that Syed Hassan Nasrallah is our father, is not just a political leader, but he's our father. Can you talk about what that means to the people of South Lebanon?
Yes, you could see how emotional people were during the funeral. And during the funeral procession, often they would get emotional, but often they would be chanting slogans and uh, listening to the poets and the speakers and the messages of condolences. And it was very difficult. The crowd was so enormous. Again, 1.45 million people. Imagine that in a city like Beirut. We It took us from 8 a.m. and we were guests. I was in the stadium. I was on the grass. Of course, the grass was covered to protect it, but I was in the stadium. It took us from 8 a.m., a quarter to 8, to roughly, I think, maybe 11 to get inside the stadium. And then it took us, um, uh, by the time we got back to the hotel, uh, it was at 5 p.m., I think, almost 5. I may be slightly wrong. And then one of my colleagues who had come from abroad, uh, he, two colleagues came from abroad from China, uh, people who I had known before. They had to go back. One of them had to go back. And I went with him to the airport. We walked to the airport because of the crowds. So you can imagine the sheer size of this gathering. But I think it showed not only the resilience of the supporters of the resistance and the size, but also the high morale. This is not a people that felt beaten. This is not a people that felt weakened. This was a both they were mourning, but they're also celebrating their strength and their victory over the Israeli regime. If the Israeli regime felt that they had won in Lebanon, if they had actually felt that they won in Lebanon, they would not have carried out those overs with fighter jets. They would not have felt the need to do so. But because of their foolishness, because of their arrogance and stupidity, what they did was they actually strengthened the resistance. They showed the power of Hezbollah. They showed the power of the resistance where that huge crowd, no one ran away. There was no stampede. There was no people, there's footage of it. The stadium surroundings, people just stood there. And we have to keep in mind these jets were bombing them just weeks ago, just a couple of months ago. They were slaughtering women and children across the country. So it's not as if they had zero expectations or they didn't think that it was possible for these criminals to bomb them. These child killers who were flying over Beirut were the ones who were the same people who were slaughtering children in Gaza for 16 months, for years, literally, because it's not the first time Gaza. This is not the first time that slaughter was carried out in Gaza. So the point is that I think it was a show of strength. It was a show of the power of the resistance, and I think what happened yesterday will have a very big impact in the future. And it was very interesting. Again, the media that was against the resistance, the pro-Western camp, the fascists in Lebanon, there's a fascist group in Lebanon that actually collaborated with the Israeli regime in 1982 and it invaded Lebanon and together with the Israelis, they went into the Sabra Shatila camp, the Lebanese forces people, and they slaughtered 3,500 Palestinians and Lebanese Shia in 36 hours. The Israeli regime in this group. These people and others, they were saying that there's going to be a snowstorm in Beirut and the weather will be, they were doing whatever they could to convince people not to travel to Beirut from outside of Beirut, from the cities nearby. It was quite stunning the attempts to keep people from coming, but the show of force was amazing.
The media is also saying it's tens of thousands, let alone a million or even hundreds of thousands. They're saying that the stadium was 50,000, but there were perhaps tens of thousands of people on the Sunday gathering.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's the interesting thing. The stadium itself, it's clear that it was the numbers were greater than the capacity because people were on the field, they were sitting, and they were some of them were on the I don't know what they're called, the lights above the stadium. The crowd was massive. And then outside of the stadium, so you can, it's obviously already when you have the stadium, it's many tens of thousands of people. And then under the stadium, around the stadium, in the areas around, the crowd was much, much greater. So it's just an attempt by the West and Western mainstream media and legacy media and the enemies of the resistance to decrease the numbers because it doesn't look good for them. Just today, Al Qaeda in Syria, the Al Qaeda regime, they staged these protests against the Israelis taking up all their territory, which were very pathetic. They never fight the Israeli regime because they were brought to power through an alliance that included the Israeli regime. But they were like small crowds here and there chanting slogans and doing nothing really. But these people in Beirut, the numbers were, and Syria is much larger than Beirut. But these people in Beirut were the same people that held the Israeli regime to a standstill in the south after 2 months of fighting. They got nowhere. I went to the south. They couldn't even take the villages on the border. What they did was after the ceasefire, the Israelis violated the ceasefire and just came in, went into villages and destroyed all the buildings. They would put TNT into building, and the Americans and the UNIFIL, the UN forces, and the others, they didn't stop them. But Hezbollah, since it promised to abide by the ceasefire, they had to stand aside. So the Lebanese government did nothing. The Lebanese army did nothing. The UN did nothing. The Western, uh, you know, uh, regimes that were behind, they were supposed to make sure that the ceasefire was uh, being carried out correctly. They did nothing about it. So after they failed, they came in and started occupying areas. And then you saw people power, huge numbers of people when the ceasefire was supposed to end after 2 months and they were supposed to retreat and they didn't. People went and liberated the lands on the border in the south on their own. And this was led often by women. And on that day, a large number of people were murdered by the regime, and also a number of women were murdered. And there are these iconic images of women standing up against tanks, and elsewhere, iconic images of women standing in front of Israeli soldiers, and they were shooting around at the feet of this woman, but she stood her ground. You would think that this would be like the top news story on pictures in Western media, but you will not find it anywhere because these are the women of the resistance who are putting their lives at risk, and a number of them were murdered by these racist Zionists, but they took back their land. And ultimately, the regime had to leave Lebanon. They've only kept five places, which ultimately will be liberated. And in fact, it's very foolish of them to keep these 5 points in southern Lebanon because it basically shows, it's telling the world, the Israeli regime, that Hezbollah's arms are legitimate because the Lebanese state is incapable of defending the country. It's incapable of stopping Israeli jets. They have no air defense in this country because the West won't allow it. And they don't even condemn the Israelis. They didn't even complain to the UN, the government. So by carrying out these acts and by taking these points on the border, all they're doing is proving to the Lebanese people and to the world that Hezbollah's arms and its defense capabilities are necessary in order to protect the South, in order to protect Lebanon, and to keep this racist regime in check.
You spoke about iconic images of women resisting tanks. It's so ironic because position of women was the alibi used to justify invasion of Afghanistan first, and then a decade later of Libya. But they would never dare to show these images, which actually talks about resistance.
But you can't find them in the Western media. Why? Because the Western media supports these journalists that have hundreds of thousands of followers and millions of followers, some of them. They will not even tweet these images. You will never know about these images if you're not following people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian people, to the Lebanese people, to the resistance. You'll never even know about them.
We will definitely. Thanks so much. Talking about images of tanks, it brings me to the next and the final topic. We are seeing Israeli army sending tanks to the Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank. Some say that it has been done after 20 years. Others, like Mariam Barghouti, the journalist, says that it's not first time in the 20 years because in the last 10 years they have repeatedly sent tanks in the Bedouin areas. Now they are sending it to the camps in Tulkaram, Jenin, Tabas, from Ramallah and Jericho in the center to Bettelheim in the south, everywhere. And this is termed as Operation Iron Wall, which says displace 40,000 people in just 35 days. Many are calling it a de facto annexation of the occupied West Bank lands. And the Israeli defense minister has said that the people who are already displaced from these camps would not be allowed to return there, also using Trump's Gaza pronouncement as a justification to displace and ethnically cleanse people. Can you talk about this outrageous moment and why the media is seems to be completely silent on this?
Well, Western media, I think, has been exposed. The collective West has been exposed. They are the shame of humanity. They are they are inferior to the rest of humanity. They have exposed themselves to be the ultimate hypocrites. Not only are they genocidal, not only are they supportive of ethnic cleansing and ethno-supremacism, not only do they support the worst of the worst, but they pretend to be the preachers of human rights. They pretend to be our teachers and to be our superior when it comes to values and human rights and human dignity. The hypocrisy is unprecedented in world history. In the past, you had evil European empires slaughtering and taking land. Now they slaughter and take land and tell you and teach you to be like them. They teach you to believe that they are morally superior, that they are morally speaking far above you. That's the world that they have created. And so now we see not so Gaza, we saw a Holocaust in Gaza. And the West Bank has nothing to do with Gaza. Yet we're seeing a deadly uh, uh, campaign in the West Bank where children are murdered. Just in the last week, two kids were killed on the streets by snipers, by these Zionist snipers. Many others have been killed. Many kids have been killed, but just in the last few days we've had killings, and they've been kicking people out of the land, stealing their land, destroying homes, destroying infrastructure, and the West says nothing about it. And you know that all of these Western news agencies and all of the Western media, they have offices in Palestine. They have offices in Tel Aviv and in Al-Quds or Jerusalem. They're all there. Western embassies are there. These German diplomats are there. These British diplomats, all these people who consider themselves to be more civilized than us and who pretend that we're uncivilized and that they're civilized. All of these journalists with tens, if not hundreds, if not millions of followers, they say nothing about it. Why? Because they support the subjugation of the subjugation of the Palestinian people. They support the notion that the Palestinians and others are Amalek. Remember, Israeli leaders were very open about their genocidal intentions in Gaza when they called them Amalek. The prime minister called them Amalek. And in the Old Testament, they were a tribe where they were all wiped out, even their children and even their animals. And they said there were no innocents. The president said that of this regime. The minister, the so-called defense minister, the genocide minister, they spoke about cutting off electricity, preventing food from coming in, preventing water from coming in, medical supplies from coming in to Gaza. Why? Because they wanted to kill everyone, including the children. And the Western media and Western regimes went along with it because they support it. It's very clear. So we expect nothing less. And it's not just Gaza. Look at Syria. They've taken huge parts of Syria. And what has Al Qaeda and Jolani done? Nothing. Have they shot at? They're only good at beheading innocent people because they were brought into power by the United States, Erdogan, and Netanyahu. They were a part of this, U.S. conspiracy hatched by Obama uh, well over a decade ago. Timber sycamore. But some people, sadly, who supposedly support the Palestinian cause, they've been supporting U.S. policy in Syria to undermine the government so that Al Qaeda can come into power. Now that Al Qaeda is in power, the Israeli regime has taken huge parts of southern Syria, the most important territories, 30 to 40% of the water, all of the key mountains, in order to also surround Hezbollah. And what does Jolani and his gang do? Nothing. So the Israelis are ethnically carrying out ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. They carried out a Holocaust in Gaza. They carried out mass murder in Lebanon. They've taken huge territory in Syria. There's not a single condemnation. Turkey continues to sell it cheap oil from Baku. The Emirates does business as usual. On my way here to Beirut, I had to go through the Emirates, and you saw there were uh, uh, Israelis in the airport, just stunning. And I knew they were there, but to see it is something else for me. And then Jordan and Egypt, business as usual, in the West collectively helping them with the genocide, and the Western media saying nothing. If a single person in Iran is beaten by the police, they will carry out a mass campaign. If someone in Russia, uh, someone from the opposition dies of a heart attack, they will carry out a massive campaign. If something happens in China, there will be a mass campaign. But if there's mass slaughter, they will assist it and they will justify it and they will go quiet and walk away when it's Palestine or when it's our region.
Talking about this double standard, I was also reading about how the coordinated state sponsored attack in the north in Tulkaram, Jenin, Tabas has been supplemented with coordinated non-state settlers attack at the center and the south from Hebron and Bethlehem to Ramallah and so on. I was just curious, given how often you have been asked by mainstream media about non-state actors in Iraq, in Yemen, in South Lebanon. Have you ever been asked about non-state actors in the occupied West Bank? And have you ever been asked to talk about the Israeli-backed militia in the West Bank, who is so central in the last at least 30 years in the expansion of colonialism, settler colonialism in the occupied West Bank?
No, when it comes to Jolani and Al Qaeda and ISIS fighting against the Syrian government, they don't talk about non-state actors. They talk about freedom fighters. When it's these militias in the West Bank who carry out atrocities, they destroy homes, they destroy uh, villages, they uproot olive trees. And that's also, by the way, what they did in southern Lebanon. They uprooted all the olive trees in these towns. They leveled towns to the earth after the ceasefire. Most of the towns were intact. The Israelis lost the battle. They couldn't even get that, like towns that I just visited the other day, the towns that were stuck to the border, literally. The Israelis couldn't get into the towns. But after the ceasefire, they came in and blew up building by building and uprooted the trees. They're just so disgusting. They're such, brutes. They have no respect for civilians or for any. And you have Western journalists in Beirut. It's not like Gaza where they can pretend they don't have a presence. They all have a presence in Beirut. All of the Western major outlets. They know what's been going on in southern Lebanon or the Israelis flying jets over, but you won't hear it in the Western media because it's okay. It's fine because these people are basically agents of empire. They can pretend that they're journalists, but they're stenographers. And whether it's in the West Bank, as you pointed out, or whether it's in Syria, that's how they're either going to be silent about it or they're going to justify it because they're agents of empire. And every now and then they may admit something, but that's only to create this facade of, credibility because they have no credibility. They are, as I said, they're inferior to the rest of humanity. They're less civilized than the rest of humanity. We've seen what they've been doing, and we see what they're doing as we speak. The scenes in Beirut when the Israeli jets flew over the mourners twice to create panic and terror, but failed. That would create outrage across the world if it was anyone else. But it didn't even appear in the Western media. It wasn't even condemned by the government in Beirut, because they are so deeply uh, uh, beholden by the United States and the West. So no, they never ask me about the non-state actors in the Gaza in the West Bank or the non-state actors in Syria. But when it comes to Hezbollah, which has uh, uh, parliamentary members, which has members in the cabinet, when it comes to Ansarallah, which runs the country, their capital is in Sana'a. They are the effective government. They've been the effective government for a decade, but they won't recognize it because it is opposed to Western hegemony domination. But I think the funeral in Beirut shows that the resistance is powerful and that the West has failed and the Israeli regime has failed. And I think this funeral will have consequences, and it will strengthen uh, the supporters of the resistance across the board.
Agents of empire also reflect the choices of word in the media. One side is settlers, which has a, unfortunately or fortunately, it has a positive connotation, particularly in the settler colonies in North America, in Oceania, and so on. And the other side is militias, terrorists, and so on. So But that was Professor Mohammad Marandi joining us from Beirut. Professor Marandi, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.